Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, Georgia has arrested at least 20 officials for misusing the flock surveillance database. And yeah, personally, I think that's a good thing. I think, if the government officials do misuse surveillance tech or anything for that matter, they should be arrested. But sadly, this is much more the exception rather than the rule. Normally when it comes to government officials, they're never going to be held accountable since they're in a position of authority. But this is one of the few times, I guess, they are being held accountable, which I think is good. And that was the story from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And next we have, Trump says Greenland will be under U.S. control by the time he leaves office. In parentheses, dear leader promises more awards within 2 years, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the World News subreddit. And it looks like an article from AOL. Trump says Greenland will be under U.S. control by this time, the time he leaves office. And yeah, personally, I don't really buy that. I think the Greenland stuff's some kind of a distraction, because, the U.S. already kind of de facto controls Greenland through NATO, and Trump's just kind of autistically obsessed with it. It's one of his hyperfixations. But other than that, I think nothing is really ever going to happen with that. Nothing happened the last 2 or 3 times he brought it up. So why should something happen this time, I think it's just kind of political theater, if anything. Just, but it's a lot of politics is just political theater, especially these days. You might as well be watching the WWE. Next we have, I am a left libertarian, Jeff Riggenbach, posted by Don't Reply If This ACC, I guess it's short for account, and that's a YouTube video from Liberty in Our Lifetime, Why I'm a Left Libertarian, Jeff Riggenbach. And yeah, personally, I think people should be less focused on if they're a left or right libertarian, and more focused on just being libertarian in general. If you want to use whatever label you want to, but ultimately, left or right is ultimately just a spectrum of, economics. I guess you could argue socialist issues as well. But regardless, I definitely do think, we need more libertarian unity. If you want to label yourself as a left or right libertarian, that's fine. But right now, I think people should probably focus on libertarian rather than the left or right. So how a lot of libertarian socialists, quote unquote libertarian socialists, I should say, like 95% of them put the socialist for the libertarian. I don't want the right and left libertarians doing the same thing, putting the right and the left for the libertarian. Next we have, the health policy cult's misplaced faith in government, posted by Socialist or Morons, and that's an article from Cato.org. And yeah, I would agree with that, ultimately, I think the solution for healthcare is if people want the government to pay for it and want to have their taxpayer dollars voluntarily spent to do so, I think they should be able to. If they earmark their taxpayer dollars to go to government spent healthcare, they should be able to. But I definitely do think the private sector should be an option as well. Ideally, healthcare is something that, each person should fund however they feel like, if they want to fund it through crowdfunding or using their own money or, using government tax dollars if they're funded, if people specifically earmark for them for that, I think that's fine. But right now, the progressives want the government to completely control healthcare, like in other countries like Canada or the UK, and I don't think that's the libertarian position. The libertarian position involves for as much individual choice as possible, and having the government completely control something isn't having people have having individual choice in that matter. Next we have, why Trump quietly carved out doctors from his own visa freeze, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, that just goes to show you the state. If Trump wants to carve out whoever wants to carve out from his visa freeze, he's in a position of authority to do so. The executive branch is the one that enforces the laws. And yeah, personally, I don't think there should be a visa freeze. But, if they want to justify enforcing a visa freeze and allowing exemptions for certain people in regards to that visa freeze, they have every ability to do so. Next we have, I'm sick of MAGA infiltrating most libertarian groups online. Too many of them hate the concept of individual liberty. I fought the liberty movement between 2008 and 2012. I joined 2008 was just fine, but it seems like since Trump was elected in 2016, it's all gone downhill. And yeah, personally, I think that's a large part, as we said earlier, people putting the left or the right for the libertarian, people need to focus on being the libertarian first and foremost. They want to provide position extensions to that, like if they want to consider themselves right-wing or left-wing, I think they should be able to, but, people need to focus on being libertarian first and foremost, and that sadly, these days people are more focused on, whether they're a leftist or a rightist rather than being a libertarian. I mean, that's a big reason for why the libertarian movement's gone downhill. Next, we have Meet the Spice Entrepreneur challenging Trump's newest tariffs from Reason.com, posted by Giant Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think if anyone wants to challenge anything for any reason, I think they should be able to. I definitely do think, people should be challenging Trump on his tariffs because, tariffs are just a tax on imported goods. I do think you should be buying local, but I don't think the government should be taxing you for anything, and that does include tariffs since they're just a form of tax, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Capital One says it closed Trump Organization's accounts after anti-money laundering probe from Reuters.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think if Capital One wants to justify doing that, it should be able to. It's a private organization. If they want to justify closing whoever's accounts wants to close, it should be able to. But if that being said, I'm sure if it was a private organization closing a Democrat group's accounts, Reddit would think it's the worst thing ever. So yeah, personally, I do think people should choose to it should be freedom of association. But when the big bang comes to debank you, I definitely do think that's not good, especially if you haven't really done anything wrong other than wrong think on social media. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Quid Pro Quo Before All, posted by Woke Boogeyman. That's across from the bond market subreddit, and that's Brian Krasen sharing a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, and Trump truths green candles, beautiful green candles, and then Brian Krasenstein replied, Trump's True Social has just officially launched their $100,000 per month paid service offering faster access to President Trump's market manipulating posts. Below is what you're paying $100,000 per month for. He's manipulating the stock market and then charging people to have the ability to insider trade. Things don't get any more corrupt than this. And I'd agree with that, but ultimately, the libertarian position is if Trump wants to charge early access to his True Social post, he should be able to. But that being said, if he's just going to use that to do insider trading, I personally don't care for government officials insider trading. But of course, Reddit, a lot of them insider trade, but Reddit only cares about Donald Trump insider trading. Nancy Pelosi's one of the biggest insider traders in Congress, and they don't care about her insider trading nearly as much. And it just goes to show you that, it's politics for most people is no consistent values, only teams. They'll be completely fine when a Democrat comes back into the White House and starts grifting. Probably not as bad as Trump, because Trump's kind of really bad when it comes to grifting, stuff like this. But, they'll be fine with all the progressive, all the taxpayer dollars being funneled into their progressive NGO friends and all that. And it just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter which party is in power. The government officials are going to act self-serving just like everyone else, and that includes the president. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Texas hemp regulations tightening, banning most THC products and raising fees. Penalties to individuals include life in prison. Businesses can survive just a fine, however. Posted by Swamp Hanky Dan. That's crossed from the Law subreddit, and that's an article from KLTV.com. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian positions, we shouldn't have any products be banned, regardless of how bad they may be for you. I personally don't care for all the cannabis stuff. It's not kind of my thing. But if people want to justify doing it, that should be on them. They should be able to do whatever they want to. And that, I think it's interesting though, right? It's like when it comes to weed, but it's like, why can't just people do what they want to? When it comes to tobacco, they're like, big tobacco is killing people. We gotta ban cancer sticks. And I personally think that, it just goes to show you, Reddit would make what it wants to be illegal, but suddenly when they want is illegal, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Next, we have your overall take on Ron Paul's impact on liberty movement, posted by Historical Donut 6758, and they said, I say it's a mixed bag. Even though some of us became anarchists after we learned more about economics and foreign policy from a libertarian perspective, many more of these libertarians would have been influenced by Ron Paul went on to become right-wing extremists, IMO. And yeah, personally, I think that, Ron Paul, for a uniparty politician, he's pretty based, I would say. He's probably as base as you can get for a uniparty politician. Maybe Thomas Massey is even more based, but that's one of the rare examples I can think of. Justin Amash is another good one too. But yeah, personally, I do think Ron Paul is probably one of the best mainstream libertarians there are. He might not be perfect on everything. He's a uniparty politician after all. Well, at least when he was running for the Republican nomination, not when he was the Libertarian Party nominee in 1988. But regardless, I do think, Ron Paul helped mainstream a lot of libertarian issues, and that's something that people should be eternally grateful to him for. You could also argue he allowed the GOP to co-opt libertarianism to an extent, but I personally think that the good he's done far outweighs the bad he's done, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Never Forget, posted by ShadowNets5462, and that's a cross post from the powerful JRE subreddit, and that's a screenshot of an article. Jimmy Kimmel says unvaccinated people shouldn't get ICU beds in hospitals. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's very funny. Jimmy Kimmel is very much not a comedian at this point. He's pretty much an MSNBC style, or I guess MS Now they're calling it now, but I think people still usually going to default to MSNBC like they say Twitter instead of X. But regardless, he's very much an cable news style, I should say, propagandist rather than any comedian. And that's why, I don't think he should have been yanked off the air last year for the Charlie Kirk comments. But I think, the libertarian perspective is just let him become the irrelevant hack that he is. It's just saying whatever he wants to say, and no one really watching. He's pretty much just if it were up to me, he'd be. I'd have him, if I was the president of ABC. I'd throw that fucker off the air. But it doesn't really matter, I would say, because no one watches the show anyway. And it's like what happened to Colbert. They took Colbert off the air, and Reddit will try censorship. It's interesting, whenever you get banned from a subreddit, the Reddit moderator says, "Oh, no one's entitled to a platform judge." But then CBS cancels Colbert's show, and suddenly they're like, "Wow, CBS just can't cancel my favorite propaganda show like that." Just go to show you, no consistent values, only teams. When Colbert gets censored, Reddit's like, "Wow, my freedom of speech," but that woman in Minnesota yells the N-word at a black man and gets charged for it, and they're like, "That's not freedom of speech. Hate speech isn't freedom of speech." And just go show you, freedom of speech when it comes to Reddit, it's very much they have no ground to stand on. Reddit progressives who want what they deem to be hate speech or misinformation to be legalized aren't really for freedom of speech. They just want speech that they like to be legal. Anything else is just going to be labeled as illegal speech. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, Trump said tariffs on aluminum would boost domestic production. The White House now admits that it didn't happen, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a link for a story from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I think, we should have more domestic production of things like aluminum. But sadly, people are reliant on when it, they want to just outsource everything to overseas when it comes to production of stuff like that. And I do think, tariffs can be well-intentioned in that regard, encouraging factories to produce things that, you can get for cheaper overseas. But I definitely do think if you can make something for cheaper overseas, you should, and want to justify doing it, you should be able to, and it shouldn't be taxed extra than something that's made domestically. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have, what does Benjamin Netanyahu do to control anyone and everyone in power? Posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the conspiracy subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that the libertarian position is, if you want to support Israel, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to support Israel if you don't want to. Right now, though, the government of the state's in a position where pretty much everyone inside of it supports Israel, even so-called progressives like AOC is going to vote to fund Israel aid when it's marketed as defensive aid, and it just goes to show you that, and all the people, a lot of the rightists who say, oh, the progressives call anyone who says all racist, homophobic, etc. will just label you anti-Semitic for noticing. And yeah, personally, if people want to support Israel, I think that's fine. But, ultimately, I think, the libertarian position is if you shouldn't be forced to support Israel if you don't want to. I like how Trump ran on a campaign of America first, but, he gets into office and suddenly he's Israel first, and that's not something that I think is very libertarian. I think libertarian is you gotta support your own community first and foremost rather than care about the entire world. And yeah, I do think, if the U.S. wants to be up Israel's ass, the U.S. government, I should say, is up Israel's ass because the Israel lobby is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington D.C. I think that's their prerogative. But I definitely do think we should focus on domestic issues first and foremost rather than foreign issues. The U.S. shouldn't be the world's police. The U.S. shouldn't be constantly getting involved in wars in the Middle East or anywhere in the world for that matter. But sadly, it just goes to, regardless of which branch of the party's in power, it just doesn't seem to change when it comes to that regard. And sadly, that's just how politics is a lot of time. It's all just theater. They all agree on like 95% of the stuff behind the scenes while using divisive cultural war issues like abortion, LGBTQ, or BLM to divide people. So meanwhile they just all bend over for Israel when it comes time for voting for voting, like and that's my thoughts there. Next we have what smart people are saying about Trump media charging for early access to the president's True Social post, hosted by Swampanky Dan, and that's crosspost from the Wall subreddit, and that's an article from Business Insider. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, if Trump wants to charge for its early access to True Social post, I think he should be able to, but he's just it's just kind of a grift. But it's like a lot of everything else he does, and that's not something I particularly care for. Next we have, it's the day Mitch McConnell suddenly has a medical emergency, or do we wait till tomorrow? Posted by Plasma M30, and they said, this is clearly a delay tactic for an runoff election, but what can anyone actually do to prove he's alive, incapacitated, or dead? Is there any legal recourse? And yeah, personally, I don't know if there's any legal recourse currently, but ultimately, it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter if the politicians in power are even alive or dead. People are going to justify having them in there as long as they have the correct letter next to their name. And yeah, it just goes to show you that politics isn't real. A lot of people in charge aren't really in charge. They're really just figureheads. Well, the deep state, military-industrial complex, the Shankwall lizard people, whatever you want to call them, really runs the country. Next we have, why does Trump want to give millions of dollars to right-wing Europeans, from Reason.com, hosted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, if Trump wants to justify giving millions of dollars to whoever he wants to, he has the ability to do so. But I personally don't think, that he should be giving taxpayer dollars to right-wing people in other countries. I don't think he should be giving taxpayer dollars to anyone in any other country. But ultimately, when it comes to taxpayer dollars, the state's in a position where it can throw them wherever they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next we have, Jacqueline Alemany from MSNBC was left stunned by Abdul El Sayed, who very eloquently shut down her bad faith questioning posted by Rabat Ascalon, and that's crosspost from the Normal Day in America subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that, I don't really care for MSNBC or MS Now, I guess they're calling it now, or whatever bullshit we might call it. I don't really care for cable news, I don't really agree with Abdul El Sayed on a lot either, but he's definitely strikes me as one of the more principled Democrats currently running for office, especially against his opponent, Hallie Stevens, who is a DNC swamp monster. But, ultimately, I think the primaries say so. Whoever gets more votes is going to win, but I don't think it's really going to matter, because, in the long run, some people might say good stuff on the campaign trail, but then they got in office and pretty much any other swamp monster. Just look at John Fetterman or Kristen Sinema. So in reality, I don't think it really matters as much. If as I always say, if voting matters, they wouldn't let us do it, and this is a good example of that. Next we have, GOP senators sign off on corrupt immunity deal from IRS audits for Trump and Sons, from post by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Politics subreddit. And that's an article from democracydocket.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But, that's ultimately how government works. Self-interested first and foremost. And if they want to justify doing that, they have every ability to do so. Next we have, truth will out, IPAC conspired with Hallie Stevens to throw the Michigan Senate race to Michigan Beck Rogers to Ward Rogers for putting Netanyahu's Israel merger and U.S. military bill in the NDAA 2027. Vote Abdul El Sayed on Tuesday, August 4th to throw a wrench into the IPAC plot, posted by Jamjar0070, and that's crosspost from the Depropagandized News subreddit. And yeah, personally, if I'm not really into voting for any uniparty politicians, maybe Thomas Massey, he's one of the rare exceptions, but, I definitely would go for El Sayed over Stevens, because he seems more like he's actually principled, especially when it comes to being anti-Israel, but then, he just might screw you over when he actually gets into office, so I don't think it really matters in the long run. Next, we have appellate court removes Libertarian candidate from NJ7 ballot after Deputy Attorney General declines to back constitutional claim. Posted by Dark Clark, and that's crossed from the New Jersey Libertarian subreddit. It's from the it's an article from the New Jersey Globe, and I actually responded to this on Libertarian Party USA subreddit, since they banned me on Libertarian Censored subreddit because it's Reddit, it's like, oh, freedom of speech, but then they ban any dissent at all when they're Reddit mods, so you not take them seriously on that issue. But anyway, I did reply to this on Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, just goes to show why elections are going to be inherently unfair. The state can remove anyone from the ballot for any reason they feel like, especially if they happen to be third party. And yeah, and it looks like the OP of that post probably from going onto this rule to an article from Justia.com. The person who circulates petitions shall not be required to be registered to vote, but shall be voter eligible, means at least 18 years of age, resident of the state. So because a few people here helping got signatures were from New York, he got removed. Pretty much bullshit, but to be fair, I can't be unbiased about that rule. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, they can make whatever rules they want. Ideally, I think if anyone who wants to be on a ballot should be able to be on a ballot. But sadly, it's a lot easier when you're a member of the Uniparty versus being a member of a principled third party. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.